Welcome to Exploration Dreamland, a quiet read-aloud of the writings of explorers of the real world and the worlds of imagination. Drop anchor, relax into your comfortable bunk, and drift off to Dreamland with us as we read Storm Over Warlock by Andre Norton. If you would like to stay in touch between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Exploration Dreamland. If you would like to recommend a text, please email us at explorationdreamland, all one word, @gmail.com. The first season of this podcast is dedicated to the memory of my friend, Ed Sears. He was a runner, coach, science enthusiast, and science fiction aficionado who was often gently encouraging of my crazy ideas. Now, take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, relax any tension in your muscles. Close your eyes. Snuggle into your sleeping space and listen to tonight's tale. Storm Over Warlock by Andre Norton, originally published in 1960. Chapter 5, Pursuit. As the raft revolved slowly, it also slipped downstream at a steadily increasing pace, for the current had them in hold. The wolverines pressed close to Shan until the musky scent of their fur, their animal warmth, enveloped him. One growled deep in its throat, perhaps in answer to that wind-borne wail. "Hound?" Shan asked. Beside him in the dark, Torvald was working loose one of the poles they had readied to help control the raft's voyaging. The current carried them along, but there was a need for those lengths of sapling to fend them free from rocks and water-buried snags. "What hound?" the younger man demanded more sharply when there came no immediate answer. "The Throg's tracker. But why did they import one?" Torvald's puzzlement was plain in his tone. He added a moment later, with some of his usual firmness, "We may be in for bad trouble now. Use of a hound means an attempt to take prisoners." "Then they do not know that we are here, as Terrans, I mean?" Torvald seemed to be sorting out his thoughts when he replied to that. "They could have brought a hound here just on the chance that they might miss one of us in the initial mop-up. Or, if they believe we're natives, they could want a specimen for study." "Wouldn't they just blast down Terrans on sight?" Shan saw the dark blot which was Torvald's head shake in negation. "They might need a live Terran, badly and soon." "Why?" "To operate the camp call beam." Shan's momentary bewilderment vanished. He knew enough of survey procedure to guess the reason for such a move on the part of the aliens. "The settler transport?" "Yes, the ship. She won't planet here without the proper signal. And the Throgs can't give that. If they don't take her, their time's run out before they have even made a start here." "But how could they know that the transport is nearly due? When we intercept their calls, they're pure gibberish to us. Can they read our codes?" "The supposition is that they can't. Only, concerning Throgs, all we know is supposition. Anyway, they do know the routine for establishing a Terran colony, and we can't alter that procedure except in small non-essentials," Torvald said grimly. "If that transport doesn't pick up the proper signal to set down here on schedule, her captain will call in the patrol escort, then exit one Throg base. But If the beetleheads can trick the ship in and take her, then they'll have a clear 5 or 6 more months here to consolidate their own position. After that, it would take more than just one patrol cruiser to clear Warlock. It will require a fleet. So the Throgs will have another world to play with, and an important one. This lies on a direct line between the Odin and Kukulkan systems. A Throg base on such a trade route could eventually cut us right out of this quarter of the galaxy. So, you think they want to capture us in order to bring the transport in? By our type of reasoning, that would be a logical move. If they know we're here. They haven't too many of those hounds, and they don't risk them on petty jobs. I'd hoped we'd covered our trail well, but we had to risk that attack on the camp. I needed the map case. Again, Torvald might have been talking to himself. Time and the right maps. He brought his fist down on the raft, making the platform tremble. That's what I have to have now. Another patch of light willows stretched along the riverbanks, and as they sailed through that ribbon of ghostly radiance, they could see each other's faces. Torvald's was bleak, hard, his eyes on the stream behind them, as if he expected at any moment to see a Throg emerge from the surface of the water. Suppose that thing, Shan pointed upstream with his chin, follows us. What is it, anyway? Hound, suggested Terran dog, but he couldn't stretch his imagination to believe in a working cooperation between Throg and any mammal. A rather spectacular combination of toad and lizard, with a few other grisly touches, is about as close as you can get to a general description. And that won't be too accurate, because like the Throgs, its remote ancestors must have been of the insect family. If the thing follows us, and I think we can be sure that it will, we'll have to take steps. There is always this advantage. Those hounds cannot be controlled from a flyer, and the beetleheads never take kindly to foot slogging. So we won't have to expect any speedy chase. If it slips its masters in rough country, we can try to ambush it. In the dim light, Torvald was frowning. I flew over the territory ahead on 2 sweeps, and it is a queer mixture. If we can reach the rough country bordering the sea, we'll have won the first round. I don't believe that the Throgs will be in a hurry to track us in there. They'll try 2 alternatives to chasing us on foot. 1, use their energy beams to rake any suspect valley, and since there are hundreds of valleys all pretty much alike, that will take some time. Or they can attempt to shake us out with a dum-dum, should they have one here, which I doubt. Shan tensed. The stories of the effects of the Throg's dum-dum weapon were anything but pretty. And to get a dum-dum, Torvald continued, as if he were discussing a purely theoretical matter and not a threat of something worse than death, they'll have to bring in one of their major ships, which they will hesitate to do with a cruiser near at hand. Our own danger spot now is the section we should strike soon after dawn tomorrow, if the rate of this current is what I have timed it. There is a band of desert on this side of the mountains. The river gorge deepens there, and the land is bare. Let them send a ship over, and we could be as visible as if we were sending up flares. How about taking cover now and going on only at night, suggested Shan. Ordinarily, I'd say yes. But with time pressing us now, no. If we keep straight on, we could reach the foothills in about 40 hours, maybe less, and we have to stay with the river. To strike across country there without good supplies and on foot is sheer folly. 2 days, with perhaps the Throgs unleashing their hound on land, combing from their flyers, with a desert. Shan put out his hands to the wolverines. The prospect certainly didn't seem anywhere near as simple as it had the night before when Torvald had planned this escape. But then the survey officer had left out quite a few points which were not pertinent. Was he also leaving out other essentials? Shan wanted to ask, but somehow he could not. After a while he dozed, his head resting on his knees. He awoke, roused out of a vivid dream, a dream so detailed and so deeply impressed in a picture on his mind that he was confused when he blinked at the riverbank visible in the half-light of early dawn. Instead of that stretch of earth and ragged vegetation now gliding past him as the raft angled along, he should have been fronting a vast skull stark against the sky, a skull whose outlines were oddly inhuman, from whose eyeholes issued and returned flying things, while its sharply protruding lower jaw was lapped by water. In color, that skull had been a violent clash of blood red and purple. Shan blinked again at the riverbank, seeing transposed on it still that ghostly haze of bone-bare dome, cavernous eye-holes and nose-slit, fanged jaws. That skull was a mountain, or a mountain was a skull, and it was important to him. He must locate it. He moved stiffly, his legs and arms cramped, but not cold. The wolverines stirred on either side of him. Torvald continued to sleep, curled up beyond, the pole still clasped in his hands. A flat map case was slung by a strap about his neck, its thin envelope between his arm and his body, as if for safekeeping. On the smooth flap was the survey seal, and it was fastened with a finger lock. Torvald had lost some of the bright, hard surface he had shown at the spaceport where Shan had first sighted him. There were hollows in his cheeks, sending into high relief those bone ridges beneath his eye sockets, giving him a faint resemblance to the skull of Shan's dream. His face was grimed, his field uniform stained and torn. Only his hair was as bright as ever. Shan smeared the back of his hand across his own face, not doubting that he must present an even more disreputable appearance. He leaned forward cautiously to look into the water, but that surface was not quiet enough to act as a mirror. Getting to his feet as the raft bobbed under his shift of weight, Shan studied the territory now about them. He could not match Torvald's inches, just as he must have a third less bulk than the officer. But standing, he could sight something of what now lay beyond the rising banks of the cut. That grass, which had been so thick in the meadowlands around the camp, had thinned into separate clumps, pale lavender in color. And the scrawniness of stem and blade suggested dehydration and poor soil. The earth showing between those clumps was not of the usual blue, but pallid too, bleached to gray, while the bushes along the stream's edge were few and smaller. They must have crossed the line into the desert Torvald had promised. Shan edged around to face west. There was light enough in the sky to sight tall black pyramids waiting. They had to reach those distant mountains, mountains whose feet on the other side were resting in seawater. He studied them carefully, surveying each peak he could separate from its fellows. Did the skull lie among them? The conviction that the place he had seen in his dream was real, that it was to be found on Warlock, persisted. Not only was it a definite feature of the landscape somewhere in the wild places of this world, but it was also necessary for him to locate it. Why? Shan puzzled over that, with a growing uneasiness which was not quite fear. Not yet, anyway. Torvald moved. The raft tilted and the wolverines became growly. Shan sat down, one hand out to the officer's shoulder in warning. Feeling that touch, Torvald shifted, one hand striking out blindly in a blow which Shan was just able to avoid while, with the other, he pinned the map case yet tighter to him. "Take it easy," Shan urged. The other's eyelids flicked. He looked up, but not as if he saw Shan at all. "The cavern of the Vale," he muttered. "Utgard." Then his eyes did focus, and he sat up, gazing around him with a frown. "We're in the desert," Shan announced. Torvald got up, balancing on feet planted a little apart, looking to the faded expanse of the waste spreading from the river cut. He stared at the mountains before he squatted down to fumble with the lock of the map case. The wolverines were growing restless, though they still did not try to move about too freely on the raft, greeting Shan with vocal complaint. He and Torvald could satisfy their hunger with a handful of concentrates from the survival kit, but those dry tablets could not serve the animals. Shan studied the terrain with more knowledge than he had possessed a week earlier. This was not hunting land, but there remained the bounty of the river. "We'll have to feed Taggy and Togi," he broke the silence abruptly. "If we don't, they'll be into the river and off on their own." Torvald glanced up from one of the tough, thin sheets of map skin, again as if he had been drawn back from some distance. His eyes moved from Shan to the unpromising shore. "How? With what?" he wanted to know. Then the real urgency of the situation must have penetrated his mental isolation. "You have an idea?" "There's those fish we found them eating back by the mountain stream," Shan said, recalling an incident of a few days earlier. "Rocks here, too, like those the fish were hiding under. Maybe we can locate some of them here." He knew that Torvald would be reluctant to work the raft inshore, to spare time for such hunting, but there would be no arguing with hungry wolverines, and he did not propose to lose the animals for the officer's whim. However, Torvald did not protest. They poled the raft out of the main pull of the current, sending it in toward the southern shore in the lee of a clump of light willows. Shan scrambled ashore, the wolverines after him, sniffing along at his heels while he overturned likely-looking rocks to unroof some odd underwater dwellings. The fish with their rudimentary legs were present, and not agile enough even in their native element to avoid well-clawed paws which scooped them neatly out of the river shallows. There was also a sleek furred creature with a broad flat head and paddle-equipped forepaws, rather like a miniature seal, which Taggy appropriated before Shan had a chance to examine it closely. In fact, the wolverines wrought havoc along a half-mile section of bank before the Terran could coax them back to the raft. As they hunted, Shan got a better idea of the land about the river. It was sere, the vegetation dwindling except for some rough spikes of things pushing through the parched ground like flayed fingers, their puffed redness in contrast to the usual amethystine coloring of Warlock's growing things. Under the climbing sun, that whole stretch of country was revealed in a stark bareness which at first repelled and then began to interest him. He discovered Torvald standing on the upper bluff, looking out toward the waiting mountains. The officer turned as Shan urged the wolverines to the raft, and when he jumped down the drop to join them, Shan saw he carried a map strip unrolled in his hand. The situation is not as good as we hoped, he told the younger man. We'll have to leave the river to cross the heights. Why? There are rapids, bending in a falls. The officer squatted down, spreading out the strip and making stabs at it with a nervous fingertip. Here we have to leave. This is all rough ground, but lying to the south there's a gap which may be a pass. This was made from an aerial survey. Shan knew enough to realize to what extent such a guide could go wrong. Main features of the landscape would be clear enough from aloft, but there might be unsurmountable difficulties at ground level which were not distinguishable from the air. Yet Torvald had planned this journey as if he had already explored their escape route, and that it was as open and easy as a stroll down Tyre's main transport way. Why was it so necessary that they try to reach the sea? However, since he had no objection to voice except a dislike for indefinite information, Shan did not question the other's calm assumption of command. Not yet, anyway. As they embarked and worked back into the current, Shan studied his companion. Torvald had freely listed the difficulties lying before them. Yet he did not seem in the least worried about their being able to win through to the sea. Or if he was, his outer shell of unconcern remained uncracked. Before their first day together had ended, the younger Terran had learned that to Torvald he was only another tool, to be used by the survey officer in some project which the other believed of primary importance. And his resentment of the valuation was under control so far. He valued Torvald's knowledge, but the other's attitude chilled and rebuffed his need for something more than a half-partnership of work. Why had Torvald come back to Warlock in the first place? And why had it been necessary for him to risk his life, perhaps more than his life if their theory was correct concerning the Throg's wish to capture a Terran, to get that set of maps from the plundered camp? When he had first talked of that raid, his promised loot had been supplies to fill their daily needs. There had been no mention of maps. By all signs, Torvald was engaged on some mission. And what would happen if he, Shan, suddenly stopped being the other's obedient underling and demanded a few explanations here and now? Only Shan knew enough about men to also know that he would not get any information out of Torvald that the latter was not ready to give, and that such a showdown, coming prematurely, would only end in his own discomfiture. He smiled wryly now, remembering his emotions when he had first seen Ragnar Torvald months ago. As if the officer ever considered the likes, dislikes, or dreams of one Shanlante. No, reality and dreams seldom approached each other. Dreams. On any of those shoreline maps, he asked suddenly, do they have marked a mountain shaped like a skull? Torvald thrust with his pole. Skull, he repeated, a little absently, as he so often did in answer to Shan's questions, unless they dealt with some currently important matter. A queer sort of skull, Shan said, just as vividly as when he had first awakened. He could picture that skull mountain with the flying things about its eye sockets. And that, too, was odd. Dream impressions usually faded with the passing of waking hours. It has a protruding lower jaw, and the waves wash that red and purple rock. What? He had Torvald's complete attention now. Where did you hear about it? That demand followed quickly. I didn't hear about it. I dreamed of it last night. I stood there right in front of it. There were birds, or things flying like birds, going in and out of the eye holes. What else? Torvald leaned across his pole, his eyes alive, avid, as if he would pull the reply he wanted out of Shan by force. That was all I remember, the Skull Mountain. He did not add his other impression, that he was meant to find that skull, that he must find it. Nothing. Torvald paused and then spoke slowly, with a visible reluctance. Nothing else? No cavern with a green veil, a wide green veil strung across it? Shan shook his head. Just the Skull Mountain. Torvald looked as if he didn't quite believe that, but Shan's expression must have been convincing, for he laughed shortly. Well, there goes one nice neat theory up in smoke, he commented. No, your skull doesn't appear on any of our maps, and so probably my cavern does not exist either. They may both be smoke screens. What? But Shan never finished that query. A wind was rising in the desert to blow across the slit which held the river, carrying with it a fine shifting of sand, which coasted down into the water as a gray haze, coating men, animals, and raft, and sighing as snow sighs when it falls. Only that did not drown out another cry, a thin cry, diluted by the miles of land stretching behind them, but yet carrying that long, ululating howl they had heard in the Throg camp. Torvald grinned mirthlessly. The hound's on the trail. He bent to the pole, using it to aid the pace of the current. Shan, chilled in spite of the sun's heat, followed his example, wondering if time had ceased to fight on their side. Chapter 6. The Hound. The sun was a harsh ball of heat baking the ground, and then, in some odd manner, drawing back that same fieriness. In the coolness of the eastern mountains, Shan would not have believed that Warlock could hold such heat. The men discarded their jackets early as they swung to dip the poles. But they dared not strip off the rest of their clothing lest their skin burn. And again gusts of wind now drove sand over the edge of the cut to blanket the water. Shan wiped his eyes, pausing in his eternal push, to look at the rocks which they were passing in threatening proximity. For the slash which held the river had narrowed, and the rock of its walls was naked of earth, save for sheltered pockets holding the drift of sand dust, while boulders of all sizes cut into the path of the flowing water. He had not been mistaken. They were going faster even than their efforts with the poles would account for. With the narrowing of the bed of the stream, the current was taking on a new swiftness. Shan said as much, and Torvald nodded. We're approaching the first of the rapids. Where we get off and walk around, Shan croaked wearily. The dust gritted between his teeth, irritated his eyes. Do we stay beside the river? As long as we can, Torvald replied somberly. We have no way of transporting water. Yes, a man could live on very slim rations of food, continue to beat his way over a bad trail if he had the concentrate tablets they carried. But there was no going without water, and in this heat such an effort would finish them quickly. Always they both listened for another cry from behind, a cry to tell them just how near the Throg hunting party had come. No Throg flyers yet, Shan observed. He had expected one of those black plates to come cruising the moment the Hound had pointed the direction for their pursuers. Not in a storm such as this. Torvald, without releasing his hold on the raft pole, pointed with his chin to the swirling haze cloaking the air above the cut walls. Here the river dug yet deeper into the beginning of a canyon. They could breathe better. The dust still sifted down, but not as thickly as a half-hour earlier. Though over their heads the sky was now a grayish lid, shutting out the sun, bringing a portion of coolness to the travelers. The survey officer glanced from side to side, watching the banks as if hunting for some special mark or sign. At last he used his pole as a pointer to indicate a rough pile of boulders ahead. Some former landslide had quarter-dammed the river at that point, and the drift of seasonal floods was caught in and among the rocky pile to form a prickly peninsula. In there. They brought the raft to shore, fighting the faster current. The wolverines, who had been subdued by the heat and the dust, flung themselves to the rocks with the eagerness of passengers deserting a sinking ship for certain rescue. Torvald settled the map case more securely between his arm and side before he took the same leap. When they were all ashore, he prodded the raft out into the stream again, pushing the platform along until it was sucked by the current past the line of boulders. Listen. But Shan had already caught that distant rumble of sound. It was steady, beating like some giant drum. Certainly it did not herald a Throg ship in flight, and it came from ahead, not from their back trail. Rapids, perhaps even the falls, Torvald interpreted that faint thunder. Now, let's see what kind of a road we can find here. The tongue of boulders, spiked with driftwood, was firmly based against the wall of the cut, but it sloped up to within a few feet of the top of that gap, more than one landslide having contributed to its fashioning. The landing stage paralleled the river for perhaps some 50 feet. Beyond it, water splashed a straight wall. They would have to climb and follow the stream along the top of the embankment, maybe being forced well away from the source of the water. By unspoken consent, they both knelt and drank deeply from their cupped hands, splashing more of the liquid over their heads, washing the dust from their skins. Then they began to climb the rough ascent up which the wolverines had already vanished. The murk above them was less solid, but again the fine grit streaked their faces, embedding itself in their hair. Shan paused to scrape a film of mud from his lips and chin. Then he made the last pull, bracing his slight body against the push of the wind he met there. A palm struck hard between his shoulders, nearly sending him sprawling. He had only wits enough left to recognize that as an order to get on, and he staggered ahead until rock arched over him and the sand drift was shut off. His shoulder met solid stone, and having rubbed the sand from his eyes, Shan realized he was in a pocket in the cliff walls. Well overhead, he caught a glimpse of natural amber sky through a slit, but here was a twilight which thickened into complete darkness. There was no sign of wolverines. Torvald moved along the pocket southward, and Shan followed him. Once more they faced a dead end, for the crevice, with the sheer descent to the river on the right, the cliff wall at its back, came to an abrupt stop in a drop which caught at Shan's stomach when he ventured to look down. If some battleship of the interstellar fleet had aimed a force beam across the mountains of Warlock, cutting down to what lay under the first envelope of planet skin, perhaps the resulting wound might have resembled that slash. What had caused such a break between the height on which they stood and the much taller peak beyond, Shan could not guess. But it must have been a cataclysm of spectacular dimensions. There was certainly no descending to the bottom of that cut. and reclimbing the rock face on the other side. The fugitives would either have to return to the river with all its ominous warnings of trouble to come, or find some other path across that gap which now provided such an effective barrier to the west. Down. Just as Torvald had pushed him out of the murk of the dust storm into the crevice, so now did that officer jerk Shan from his feet, forcing him to the floor of the half-cave from which they had partially emerged. A shadow moved across the bright band of sunlit sky. Back! Torvald caught at Shan again, his greater strength prevailing as he literally dragged the younger man into the dusk of the crevice, and he did not pause, nor allow Shan to do so, even when they were well under cover again. At last they reached the dark hole in the southern wall which they had passed earlier, and a push from Torvald sent his companion into that. Then a blow greater than any the survey officer had aimed at him struck Shan. He was hurled against a rough wall with impetus enough to explode the air from his lungs, the ensuing pain so great that he feared his ribs had given under that thrust. Before his eyes, fire lashed down the slit, searing him into temporary blindness. That flash was the last thing he remembered as thick darkness closed in, shutting him into the nothingness of unconsciousness. It hurt to breathe. He was slowly aware first of that pain, and then the fact that he was breathing, that he had to endure the pain for the sake of breath. His whole body was jarred into a dull torment as a weight pressed upon his twisted legs. Then strong animal breath puffed into his face. Shan lifted one hand by willpower, touched thick fur, felt the rasp of a tongue laid wetly across his fingers. Something close to terror engulfed him for a second or two when he knew that he could not see. The black about him was colored by jagged flashes of red, which he somehow guessed were actually inside his eyes. He groped through that fire-pierced darkness. An animal whimper from the throat of the shaggy body pressed against him. He answered that movement. "Taggy?" The shove against him was almost enough to pin him once more to the wall, a painful crush on his aching ribs as the wolverine responded to his name. That second nudge from the other side must be Togi's bid for attention. But what had happened? Torvald had hurled him back just after that shadow had swung over the ledge. That shadow... Shan's wits quickened as he tried to make sense of what he could remember. A Throg ship. Then that fiery lash which had cut after them could only have resulted from one of those energy bolts such as had wiped out the others of his kind at the camp. But he was still alive. "Torvald?" he called through his personal darkness. When there was no answer, Shan called again, more urgently. Then he hunched forward on his hands and knees, pushing Taggy gently aside, running his hands over projecting rocks, uneven flooring. His fingers touched what could only be cloth before they met the warmth of flesh, and he half threw himself against the supine body of the survey officer, groping awkwardly for heartbeat, for some sign that the other was still living. "What?" The word came thickly, but Shan gave something close to a sob of relief as he caught the faint mutter. He squatted back on his heels, pressed his forearm against his aching eyes in a kind of fierce will to see. Perhaps that pressure did relieve some of the blackout, for when he blinked again, the complete dark and the fiery trails had faded to gray, and he was sure he saw dimly a source of light to his left. The Throg ship had fired upon them, but the aliens could not have used the full force of their weapon, or neither of the Terrans would still be alive. Which meant, Shan's thoughts began to make sense which brought apprehension. The Throgs probably intended to disable rather than kill. They wanted prisoners, just as Torvald had warned. How long did the Terrans have before the aliens would come to collect them? There was no fit landing place hereabouts for their flyer. The Beetleheads would have to set down at the edge of the desert land and climb the mountains on foot, and the Throgs were not good at that. So the fugitives still had a measure of time. Time to do what? The country itself held them securely captive. That drop to the southwest was one barrier. To retreat eastward would mean running straight into the hands of the hunters. To descend again to the river, their raft gone, was worse than useless. There was only this side pocket in which they sheltered, and once the Throgs arrived, they could scoop the Terrans out at their leisure, perhaps while stunned by a controlling energy beam. Taggy? Togi? Shan was suddenly aware that he had not heard the wolverines for some time. He was answered by a weirdly muffled call from the south. Had the animals found a new exit? Was this niche more than just a niche? A cave of some length, or even a passage running back into the interior of the peaks? With that faint hope spurring him, Shan bent again over Torvald, able now to make out the other's huddled form. Then he drew the torch from the inner loop of his coat and pressed the lowest stud. His eyes smarted in answer to that light, watered until tears patterned the grime and dust on his cheeks. But he could make out what lay before them, a hole leading into the cliff face, the hole which might furnish the door to escape. The survey officer moved, levering himself up, his eyes screwed tightly shut. Lante. Here, and there's a tunnel right behind you. The wolverines went that way. To his surprise, there was a thin ghost of a smile on Torvald's usually straight-lipped mouth. And we'd better be away before visitors arrive. So he, too, must have thought his way through the sequence of past action to the same conclusion concerning the Throg movements. Can you see, Lante? The question was painfully casual, but a note in it, almost a reaching for reassurance, cut for the first time through the wall which had stood between them from their chance meeting by the wrecked ship. Better now. I couldn't when I first came to, Shan answered quickly. Torvald opened his eyes, but Shan guessed that he was as blind as he himself had been. He caught at the officer's nearer hand, drawing it to rest on his own belt. Grab hold. Shan was giving the orders now. By the look of that opening, we had better try crawling. I've a torch on at low. Good enough. The other's fingers fumbled on the band about Shan's slim waist until they gripped tight at his back. He started on into the opening, drawing Torvald by that hold with him. Luckily, they did not have to crawl far, for shortly past the entrance, the fault or vein they were following became a passage high enough for even the tall Torvald to travel without stooping. And then, only a little later, he released his hold on Shan, reporting he could now see well enough to manage on his own. The torch beam caught on a wall and awoke from there a glitter which hurt their eyes, a green-gold cluster of crystals. Several feet on, there was another flash of embedded crystals, Those might promise priceless wealth, but neither Terran paused to examine them more closely or touch their surfaces. From time to time, Shan whistled, and always he was answered by the wolverines, their calls coming from ahead. So the men continued to hope that they were not walking into a trap from which the Throgs could extract them. "Snap off your torch a moment," Torvald ordered. Shan obeyed. The subdued light vanished, yet there was still light to be seen, ahead and above. "Front door," Torvald observed. "How do we get up?" The torch showed them that a narrow ladder of ledges branching off when the passage they followed took a turn to the left and east. Afterward, Shan remembered that climb with wonder that they had actually made it, though their advance had been slow, passing the torch from one to another to make sure of their footing. Shan was top man when a last spurt of effort enabled him to draw himself out into the open, his hands raw, his nails broken and torn. He sat there, stupefied with his own weariness, to stare about. Torvald called impatiently, and Shan reached for the torch to hold it for the officer. Then Torvald crawled out. He too looked around in dull surprise. On either side, peaks cut high into the amber of the sky, but this bowl in which the men had found refuge was rich in growing things. Though the trees were stunted, the grass grew almost as high here as it did on the meadows of the lowlands. Quartering the pocket valley galloped the wolverines, expressing in that wild activity their delight in this freedom. "Good campsite." Torvald shook his head. "We can't stay here." And, to underline that gloomy prophecy, there issued from that hole through which they had just come, muffled and broken, but still threatening, the howl of the Throg's hound. The survey officer caught the torch from Shan's hold and knelt to flash it into the interior of the passage. As the beam slowly circled that opening, he held out his other arm, measuring the size of the aperture. "When that thing gets on a hot scent," he snapped off the beam, "the beetleheads won't be able to control it. There will be no reason for them to attempt to. Those hounds obey their first orders, kill or capture. And I think this one operates on capture, so they'll loose it to run ahead of their party." "And we move to knock it out?" Shan relied now on the other's experience. Torvald rose. "It would need a blaster on full power to finish off a hound. No, we can't kill it. But we can make it a doorkeeper to our advantage." He trotted down into the valley, Shan beside him without understanding in the least, but aware that Torvald did have some plan. The officer bent, searched the ground, and began to pull from under the loose surface dirt one of those nets of tough vines which they had used for cords. He thrust a double handful of this hasty harvest into Shan's hold with a single curt order. "Twist these together and make as thick a rope as you can." Shan twisted, discovering to his pleased surprise that under pressure the vines exuded a sticky purple sap which not only coated his hands, but also acted as an adhesive for the vines themselves, so that his task was not nearly as formidable as it had first seemed. With his force axe, Torvald cut down 2 of the stunted trees and stripped them of branches, wedging the poles into the rocks about the entrance of the hole. They were working against time, but on Torvald's part with practiced efficiency. Twice more that cry of the hunter arose from the depths behind them. As the westering sun, almost down now, shone into the valley hollow, Torvald set up the frame of his trap. We can't knock it out any more than we can knock out a throg, but a beam from a stunner ought to slow it up long enough for this to work. Taggy burst out of the grass, approaching the hole with purpose, and Togi was right at his heels. Both of them stared into that opening, drooling a little, the same eagerness in their pose as they had displayed when hunting. Shan remembered how that first howl of the throg hound had drawn both animals to the edge of the occupied camp, in spite of their marked distaste for its alien masters. There after it, too, he told Torvald what he had noted on the night of their sortie. "Maybe they can keep it occupied," the other commented, "but we don't want them to actually mix with it. That might be fatal." A clamor broke out in the interior passage. Taggy snarled, backing away a few steps before he uttered his own war cry. "Ready!" Torvald jumped to the net slung from the poles. Shan raised his stunner. Togi underlined her mate's challenge with a series of snarls rising in volume. There was a tearing, scrambling sound from within. Then Shan fired at the jack-in-the-box appearance of a monstrous head, and Torvald released the deadfall. The thing squalled, ropes beat growing taut. The wolverines backed from jaws which snapped fruitlessly. To Shan's relief, the Terran animals appeared content to bait the now imprisoned or collared horror without venturing to make any close attack. But he reckoned that too soon. Perhaps the stunner had slowed up the hound's reflexes, for those jaws stilled with a last shattering snap. The toad lizard mask, a head which was against all nature as the Terrans knew it, was quiet in the strangle leash of the rope, the rest of the body serving as a cork to fill the exit hole. Taggy had been waiting only for such a chance. He sprang, claws ready, and Togi went in after her mate to share the battle. Stay tuned for the next segment from Storm Over Warlock by Andre Norton. Please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Keep in touch with us on Twitter and Instagram, and recommend us to anyone you know who could use a quiet break or a little help falling asleep. Exploration Dreamland is produced, edited, and hosted by me, Sarah Van Zaley. A big thank you to Project Gutenberg for helping me find this and many other interesting publications. Thanks also to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for providing the theme music for this show. The title of this piece is Kalimba Relaxation Music, if you would like to visit his website to hear it in its entirety. Sweet dreams.